Hi folks, this is Alan. If you listen and like these podcasts, please consider making a small donation to keep these podcasts alive. Unfortunately, at the moment, I have no other means of generating an income, and I do really enjoy making these recordings for you. If you are like me, struggling to make ends meet, and you can't afford to make a small donation, then please simply press like and subscribe and recommend this podcast to a friend. That would be a tremendous help. And thanks for taking the time to listen. I really do appreciate it. And I will put the link in the description below. This will be my fifth and final boat along the Great Amazon River. A 1,060-kilometre river ride to Belém. But more about that later. It was a few hours after dropping Pierre off in Óbidos that our ferry boat silently slipped into the port of Santarém. It was a subdued 2:30 a.m. in the morning as Carlos and I walked down the gangplank and into a quiet, deserted town. Just one taxi driver and a concerned parent were standing there under the dull yellow ghoulish light of a tired street lamp. The taxi driver asked if we needed a ride, as though he was pimping his girlfriend as he looked over his shoulder. When I looked over his shoulder, I saw his car. No thanks. But was there a backpacker hostel or a guest house open at this time? I asked. Because taxi drivers know everything, and if you're lucky, they'll tell you. And he did. Hotel San Luis, a kilometre down on the right, he said. It's open 24 hours. It was good to be walking again, as we'd been cooped up on the boat for several days. And after a while, we found the hotel. In other parts of the world, it would have been called a guest house at best. An hotel was far too grand a name for it. And it was per room, not per person, so Carlos and I got a room. The next day, we trolled around the busy industrial town, trying to find cheap onward tickets to Belém. But even though we'd split up, none of us found suitable prices. I also looked into bus tickets for the only road heading east, but road travel was even more expensive because everything moved along the river. And I needed to change some money, which turned out to be a really drawn-out formal affair. And as I came out, I felt as though I'd been ripped off, but I couldn't put my finger on why I felt ripped off. Then someone suggested we checked out the port. Not where we were dropped off the night before, but about 2 or 3 kilometres further along the river. I left Mr. Peru, Carlos, to do his thing, and I walked to the port to see if I could get a result. First signs were good. Plenty of ferries, a couple of coastal tankers, and what looked like a customs boat. And there was nobody aboard the ferry boats to ask. And after mooching around the port for a while, I went into the only porter cabin office that looked inhabited. It was just inside the gate on my way in. I thought I'd just ask. And guess what? That's where they sold the tickets. No signs, nothing. And this happens a lot in foreign countries. And it's because they think everybody knows. And this happens especially with regards to directions and bus times and things like that. It's well known that in some countries, and they will remain nameless, you never ask locals. Simply because they'll point in one direction, not caring if it's right or wrong, simply because they don't know, but they're too proud to say they don't know, if that makes sense. And not only did I secure an onward ticket, but I also asked for a discount due to the fact that I'm an old man, and I got it. Carlos finally got his ticket online for the same boat without even leaving his bed. And that's the way the world works now. The next day, I set out early-ish to beat the sun and get my hammock up before the crowds of passengers swarm onto the boat. And it was scheduled to leave at 12 midday. I was really knackered by the time I got there with my heavy backpack, sweating heavily. And this ferry boat was long, seems to be longer than all the others. It had 3 decks. The bottom deck was for cargo, the middle deck for hammocks, and the top deck had nothing but cabins. And as I walked up to the top of the gangplank, there was a guy in an impressive uniform sitting at the table. I showed him my ticket and my passport too, and then walked straight along into the hammock deck. But it seems that I was late to the party, as the whole deck was almost full. And in fact I could have saved some money if I'd have stayed on the ferry last night. But I live and learn. All the best places had been snapped up. In fact, there were very few spaces left anywhere. And I prefer to be on the end so I don't annoy anybody trying to get in and out. So I found myself stringing my hammock up right on the very edge of all the other hammocks. They were tighter and more squashed together than the proverbial sardines in a can. My hammock was right in front and underneath the air conditioning unit, and only about 10 metres from the men's toilets. And this is the first boat I'd actually been on that had doors at the end of the deck and windows along the side, which makes sense if it's got aircon. But with those, it made it stuffy during the day. And this ferry boat was very different from all the previous ones. It was the first one we had with aircon, but it was also such a long deck with so many hammocks, and it was the same size as the floor above for the cabins, so there were lots of cabins. And if you look at the cover photo of this episode, you'll see what I mean. I went up and waited on the side rail for Carlos to turn up. An hour later, he turned up looking fresh, so I assumed he must have taken a taxi, as he wasn't hot and bothered, sweating or flustered. After he'd got signed in, he set up his hammock on the other side in one of the only spaces left, in amongst all the other passengers. And places were scarce now. There must have been maybe 300 hammocks squeezed tightly together on our deck. When about 20 minutes before we left, a couple of friendly gay guys set up their hammocks just next to mine, as now I was literally on the edge. And I saw people squeezing into the most impossible spaces. We left Santarém with an almost clear, sun-filled sky. The journey downriver was going to be hot and sweaty, I thought. The whole deck was in a constant hum of conversation and people moving around. Passengers were constantly coming past to the toilets or to get drinking water from the tap, which was near me too. And this constant movement only really settled down between midnight and 5 a.m. And thankfully, we had air conditioning, which automatically came on at night. But that was noisy too. And with all the other commotion, I still managed to sleep well. The gay guys next to me turned out to be a real laugh, especially the one next to me, if he was a little persistent. He kept asking me if we could get it on, trying to entice me with porn on his phone. He had everything. He started with gay porn, and then that didn't work, so then he tried heterosexual stuff, to no avail. And he kept saying, "Look, the toilets are just over there, come on." But I managed to keep him at arm's length. This boat didn't have a viewing deck, as all the other ferries had, so my days were spent on the guardrail, watching out for any wildlife or other interesting things. We only actually called in to 3 or 4 riverside villages and towns during the 1,000-kilometre journey downriver. And there were plenty of other types of boats that used the river too, especially the long craft for transporting either logs or cattle. And as we rolled down river, I always kept one eye on the edge of the rainforest and the other on the weather. Storms were fewer and further away this time. And when I said I watched out for strange things, I didn't expect what happened next. But I didn't expect some local indigenous children to come out of the rainforest to our boat like a tribal raiding party. I was surprised when it happened to see 6 or 7 dugout canoes coming out of the forest from different points along the bank and paddling furiously towards the boat was one thing. But what happened next surprised me even more. It was when passengers started to throw bags full of second-hand clothes and food over the side. I had no idea this happened. I didn't know this went on. The canoes had kids in. They'd come to the side of the boat and put their hands up like they were begging, asking for things. Bags of food and clothes were thrown from all decks and all areas of the boat as more canoes came out of the jungle. And our boat didn't actually stop, but it did slow a little, as though to help the slower canoes with the really young children in. And several passengers got so excited at that moment, but they had nothing to throw. They giggled and screamed with some sort of perverse excitement. Then they rushed off to the canteen and bought packets of biscuits and threw those, and for them to fall short and into the water, getting wet. Strangely, the canoes got close but not too close, and the children were all dressed in ragged clothes. And by now I thought this was a bit fake. It felt like a scam, but I said nothing. At one point, plastic bags of what I assumed to be second-hand clothes rained down onto the water. The children paddled hard and fast to reach the bags first, and often a fight would break out over a bag between the children. And it seemed as though every passenger on the railings, watching or taking part, had their own opinions. It was either a fiasco or an event. And it's plainly obvious that this happens every time a boat comes past. Even at one boat a day, that's a lot of clothes and biscuits or food at the end of the week. And someone on the railing near me said something. Insults started to be exchanged. Voices got louder. Then other people added their opinion. Some took sides. And then the argument broke out among several of the passengers along the side rail, and more people got involved. And before long, there was a full argument and a full verbal war. Some people were saying it was a scam, and others believed they were there saving unfortunate indigenous children from starvation and death. And as we continued downstream, other canoes came out, and some had motors. Now the boats were better, their clothes less ragged, their riverside houses that they'd come from were much better. I'd even say modern and palatial. Yet they still came, and they still put their hands up in a begging gesture, asking for money and food. By now I was convinced it was a scam. It was fake. And this only happened along this one stretch of the river, 2 kilometers long. And it possibly started a long time ago, when there was a genuine need and the people were really poor. To me now it's just a ritual that has turned children into professional beggars, professional panhandlers. And still the ferocious argument raged on between the passengers on the rail. The voices were loud now, shouting. There was pushing and shoving, long after the canoes had stopped coming out of the jungle. I'd seen and heard enough, and I left them to fight over it. But once again, it comes down to doing the right thing for the right reason, and not the right thing for the wrong reason. And having the ability to keep your opinions to yourself, and not to believe that your opinion is the only one, or the only correct one. But unfortunately, egos and pride always get in the way. And now below decks, I walk into the men's toilets, and who should be there but my friendly neighbour, the young gay guy, who was examining his face in the mirror. When he saw me, he pulled his shorts half down, exposing more than was necessary, and said, "Come on, now's our chance." And I just laughed, shaking my head. And with a lot less wildlife to be seen since entering Brazil, my main occupation has been observing the other passengers. You can learn a lot about a country by the way the people behave. This last section of my long river journey was the most entertaining one because of the interactions with the other passengers. On one of the earlier boats, a couple of young passengers thought I may be an undercover policeman or something similar, and they were suspicious of me. Then, when they learnt that I was just a backpacker, they relaxed and I got to know them well. But what does that say about the country? And given that there's several hundred passengers on this boat, there may be one or two plainclothes undercover federal police aboard, watching for smugglers and their stash. It would make sense if you're trying to stamp it out. Which brings me nicely to one man in particular. You know that instinctive gut feeling that somebody's a bad guy? He was strange, gave off a negative vibe. And he may just have been a bad guy or just an undercover cop. He just didn't feel right, to me anyway. And every time he came past, it was as though he despised everyone else, or even looked down on everybody else. I couldn't quite work it out or put my finger on it exactly, and I tried to shake the feeling, but it just wouldn't go away. Even to the point of me feeling his presence before he got to me, or when I couldn't see him but I knew he was behind me. I'd turn round and he'd be there. What and who he was, I have no idea. And I always trust my gut feeling. It's always been right in the past. On this ferry, charging your phone or whatever was a whole new experience. With only 4 original plug sockets high up on the bulkhead and an additional block of 4 on an extension cable, really wasn't enough for 200 to 300 passengers on the hammock deck. Luckily, I'm not a slave to my phone and can live comfortably without it when I have to. During this final leg of the trip, the weather's been a lot better. The storms have been a long way away and were less heavy. We pulled into a misty Belém around 8 a.m. in the morning. Carlos and I disembarked and headed into the city centre on foot to find some breakfast and somewhere to sleep that night. That was my last and final leg from Santarém to Belém in the northeast corner of Brazil. We covered 1,060 kilometres. Interesting kilometres. But that was the end of my 5,300 kilometres along the great Amazon River. And if I had to sum it up, I'd say I preferred the first 2 boats in Peru for the abundance of wildlife I saw. Certainly a lot less tension in the passengers too. And even though the ports were smellier and the boats lacked some facilities, they had character. It was a more memorable part of my whole journey for me. And if you went on a river trip, it'd be different for you too. So thanks for travelling with me, and thanks for listening to the podcast, the Travelogue. And if you were wondering if my friend turned up, you know the friend who promised to be there, which was the whole reason for me being on the river in the first place? The answer is no, he didn't.
Well, that's all for this week, folks. And please remember, the same road can be travelled 1,000 different ways, so get out there and make it your own. Until next week.